Turn off the music, put down the phone, sit in a quiet room with absolutely nothing demanding your attention. Most people can't do it for more than a few minutes before it starts to feel unbearable. Not boring, unbearable. And that's strange, isn't it? Silence isn't dangerous. Nothing is happening to you. So why does an empty room feel louder than a crowded one? The answer has very little to do with the room, and almost everything to do with what your brain does the moment it stops being told what to focus on. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network, a set of brain regions that switch on specifically when you're not focused on the outside world. It's active when you daydream, when you replay old conversations, when your mind drifts during a boring meeting. In silence, with no task and no noise to anchor you, this network doesn't go quiet. It gets louder. So when you sit down and the silence starts to feel uncomfortable, that's not nothing happening. That's something happening, just somewhere you can't see it. And this isn't a new discovery. Psychologists have been quietly fascinated and sometimes disturbed by what happens in an empty room for almost 70 years. In the 1950s, a Canadian psychologist named Hebb ran one of the first real experiments on this. He wasn't interested in silence exactly. He was interested in what happens to the mind when it's given almost nothing to work with at all. No sound, no light, barely any sensation. Just a person, alone, with their own thoughts as the only available entertainment. What he found unsettled people at the time, and honestly, it still does. Within hours, some participants began hallucinating, not because anything was wrong with them, but because a brain that's built to constantly process information doesn't simply switch off when the information stops coming. It starts generating its own. Faces appear in the dark. Sounds emerge from nothing. Thoughts loop and intensify, with nothing external to interrupt them. You're never going to experience anything that extreme from one quiet afternoon at home. But the underlying principle is exactly the same, just turned down to a much smaller volume. Take away the noise and the brain doesn't go quiet. It starts filling the gap with whatever it already had lying around. So what's it filling the gap with exactly? This is where the default mode network comes back into the picture, and where things start to feel a lot more personal. Research has linked an overactive default mode network to rumination, the kind of repetitive, circling thought pattern associated with anxiety and depression risk. In people prone to this kind of thinking, the brain doesn't use quiet moments to rest. It uses them to dig back into old material, old conversations, old mistakes, unresolved worries, almost like the silence hands it permission. This is also very likely connected to why a conversation from days or weeks ago can suddenly resurface at 2 in the morning, uninvited, on a loop. The replaying isn't random. It's what an unoccupied mind defaults to when nothing else is competing for its attention. So silence doesn't create the noise in your head. It just removes everything that was previously drowning it out. And here's the part that explains why this hits some people so much harder than others. Reactions to quiet aren't uniform. For some people, an empty room is genuinely restful, a relief from constant input. For others, the exact same room feels threatening within minutes. Researchers studying brief sensory deprivation have found that people higher in trait anxiety report more distressing experiences in these conditions, while calmer baseline states tend to predict a more neutral or even pleasant response. In other words, silence is a kind of mirror. It doesn't manufacture your anxiety, it just stops giving it competition. There's a darker historical footnote worth knowing here, because it shows just how seriously this effect has been taken outside of casual psychology content. Sensory deprivation, the deliberate removal of sound, light, and stimulation, has been studied not just in labs, but in interrogation settings where prolonged isolation and silence were used specifically because of how destabilizing they are to the mind. That history is genuinely disturbing, and it's a strong indicator of how powerful this mechanism actually is. The same basic principle that makes a quiet weekend afternoon feel mildly uncomfortable, pushed to its extreme and combined with prolonged duration and total control, becomes something that's now widely recognized as a form of psychological harm. You're not anywhere near that when you turn off your phone for 20 minutes. But it's worth knowing that the discomfort you feel in a quiet room and the discomfort studied in much more extreme conditions are, underneath everything, drawing from the same well. So is there a way out of this? Or is silence just something to be endured? This is where it gets genuinely encouraging. The same research shows the default mode network can be quieted, not just intensified. Studies have found that meditation reduces its activity, and experiences of awe, watching the ocean, standing somewhere vast, looking up at a night sky, can pull a person out of that inward spiral almost immediately. In both cases, what's happening is the same mechanism, just running in reverse. Attention gets redirected outward, away from the self, and the looping stops. Not because the underlying problem got solved in that moment, but because the part of the brain that was rehearsing it got, briefly, given something else to do. Which means silence was never really the enemy. An unoccupied, unanchored mind is. Silence just happens to be the condition that reveals it. So maybe the discomfort of sitting in a quiet room was never about the quiet at all. It was about discovering, possibly for the first time in a while, what's actually been running in the background the entire time. Underneath the music, the notifications, the conversations, the noise we've been using, maybe without even realizing it, to keep something else from being heard. If you've ever sat down to relax and somehow ended up more anxious than when you started, this is probably why. It's not a flaw, and it's not a sign that something's wrong with you. It's just a brain doing exactly what an unoccupied brain does, looking for something to think about and finding whatever's closest. And maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment, the next time a room goes quiet and it starts to feel like too much. You're not broken. You're just finally hearing what was always there. This channel exists for exactly this kind of moment. The small, ordinary things that turn out to be hiding something bigger once you actually look. If that's the kind of thinking you enjoy, subscribe, because there's a new one of these every week.